So, without further ado, no one came to see me talk today. I would love to introduce our first speaker. He is Larry Persily, and I'm trying to find the bio you gave me. Here we go. Can I make it up? Because I think I could do a really good job of making up a bio here. Oh, sorry. He is a journalist, a newspaper publisher, a former federal coordinator, a longtime voice on Alaska fiscal policy. He's worked in state government, on Capitol Hill, and in newsrooms across the state. He currently publishes the Wrangell Sentinel, writes for the Alaska Beacon and the Anchorage Daily News. He's held the Atwood Chair of Journalism at UAA and is an all-around excellent guy. Please help me welcome Larry Persily.
I don't know about all around. I know I'm tall. That counts for something. So normally my role at things like this is to be funny and not necessarily serious, but I thought I'd sort of put that aside for a little bit. I'm not going to use 10 minutes, so I'm offering to the other four, my unused minutes are for sale. I'm privatizing my 10 minutes. So I want to open for bids. I was asked to give a little bit of the history for people who maybe aren't familiar with the permanent fund. So this opening statement isn't a premonition that it's not going to be permanent anymore. It's just an observation that it has been permanent for 50 years, protecting the principal. State has a lot of tough financial choices going ahead. I think the permanent fund is essential for those, but it could take some other forms as we move ahead and want to provide public services, invest in the future, and all the rest. Why the permanent fund? 1976 constitutional amendment. I looked, how can you define it? And I like this top definition for its brevity. You know, they summed it up in 31 words. No offense to most of us here, we couldn't say anything in 31 words. But I thought it was a great definition as to what spurred that political interest, the push behind creating the permanent fund when North Slope leases were auctioned off and the state got $900 million in the 60s and spent it, much of it wisely. I mean, you think about Alaska, there was a lot of unmet needs back then, but there was this feeling we burned through $900 million, we blew it, it's wasted, we're never going to do that again. And this statement from Terry Gardner, who was a House member at the time, I thought summed it up well as to what drove that. You know, what was one, there were certainly a lot of reasons, but that was one of the key points in moving on. So we did, in 1976, if you picked up your election pamphlet, and back then it wasn't online, they were printed, sent to everyone's mail. I highlighted the last part of this ballot summary because it became really crucial when Governor Walker cut back the dividend in half with his veto in 2016. Opponents of that went to court, and the judge ruled, hey, the earnings on the permanent fund get deposited in the general fund. It's like everything else. It's subject to legislative appropriation. Even though you have a statute that says, oh, here's this formula for calculating the dividend, and they use the formula for decades, you don't have to. It's subject to appropriation. When the vote came up in 1976, we think now about all these close elections. Well, you got Anchorage, municipal assembly race is 35 votes, 40 votes or something like this. This sucker wasn't even close. I mean, this is like the fantasy of every candidate that they could win 2-1. I'm not sure we've had anything since then that's been that lopsided. The timeline was the constitutional amendment in 76. The word dividend never appeared in the amendment. The election booklet, sure, some people were thinking about, well, how could we get some money to Alaskans from this wealth? But the dividend came later. even though now, of course, they're not just attached at the hips, they're welded together, permanent fund, dividend. That's, I think, a political problem. So the first attempt at a dividend was actually based on years of residency. The longer you lived here, the bigger check you got. Court threw that out. Alaskans hated the guy named Zobel for bringing the lawsuit. And then the backstop plan was the one-size-fits-all, everybody gets the same amount. And the first checks went out in 1982. I really like this in doing some research. Jay Hammond, or Governor Jay Hammond, who many people say the father of the permanent fund, regardless of who passes the paternity test. He was certainly there at the time. Had a dinner with the People's Republic of China premier, and that last line pretty much, to me, sums it up. There's good socialism and there's bad socialism. And handing out dividends is considered good socialism in Alaska. But it also illustrates how well known we are for the dividend in the state. Just looking at the numbers, oops, I did something I didn't mean to. God, I hate technology. Remember overheads where you'd have the grease pencil and, yeah, okay. Well, I like the overheads. So just looking at the dividend numbers, first one, 1982, arbitrary number. The legislature said we'll do $1,000, even though the formula is a lot less than about 300. But since that first check, counting what you're going to get this October, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500, talking $32 billion has gone out in dividends. If you're old enough and you applied and you qualified and you weren't serving time for a felony or your third misdemeanor and you got all the checks, talking about $54,000 per person. Like I said, they followed the formula in statute. In 2016, Governor Walker said, we just can't afford this. We're burning through savings, gotta cut it down. He vetoed it in half. So ever since then, one of the last things the legislature does every year is negotiate how much the dividend's gonna be. It's just in a political appropriation now. And you're seeing it this year. Going into this session, $1,000, no question, pretty much, but with extra money coming in from high oil prices because of the president's war, a lot of pressure to increase the dividend. So hopefully that's under 10 minutes.
Well done, Larry. I'm going to pretend I'm too old to understand that overhead projector reference. I was definitely not born early enough for that. Our next speaker is Angela Rodell, the CEO, our former CEO of the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. From 2015 to 2021. During her tenure, the fund grew by more than 60%, from 50 billion to 80 billion. Thank you. Navigated the turbulence of a global pandemic, chaired organizations like the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds and the Pacific Pension and Investment Institute, and her tenure coincided with the statutory adoption of the percent of market value draw, formally establishing the fund as a sustainable revenue source for state government. Please help me welcome Angela Rodell.
It wasn't your fault, though. What? That made sound.
All right. Whoa. It's really strange when all of a sudden. So I think I got 1 minute from Larry that went to the mics. So again, it's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk a lot about what other states are doing, because I want to put how unique Alaska's Permanent Fund and the PFD is in this, and how much what happened in 2016 with the veto that Larry referred to, how much that changed how we think about the PFD. Prior to 2016, the PFD was the third rail. You did not touch it. And so here we are today, 10 years later, still debating a dividend, and the fund is trying to cook with gas, as they say. So let me just start with how unique the compact is that Alaska made. Nothing surprising. There shouldn't be anything up here that you don't already know. The 5% POMV, it's based on a 5-year rolling average with a 1-year delay, and that was intentional to allow you to close the books on the fund and the fund value. The FY26 draw is expected to be $3.8 billion. I believe the forecasted amount currently for FY27, which should be closed because it was when the 2025 fiscal year ended, will be something north of $4 billion. Created in 1976, the PFD is regarded as our social compact, is how I refer to it. It's what we agreed the permanent fund would be used for. It was passed in statute. And even though 50% was supposed to go for government, we really focus on the 50% that was devoted to the dividend. And we tend to forget or ignore or not talk about the 50% that government saved and that government continued to reinvest into the fund, allowing the fund to continue to grow. So the question for the panel is a post-PFD world inevitable, and what should replace that individual compact that we created 50, 40 some years ago? Well, let me tell you what some other states do, because I think we can learn a lot of lessons from our peers down in the lower 48. I am not going to talk about Norway. I'm going to talk about what states do that have similar type funds. And a lot of times we don't realize in Alaska just how much work has been done in the lower 48 to capitalize and save on natural resource wealth. The Permanent School Fund for the state of Texas is the world's oldest education endowment. Think about this. They created this in 1845. 1845. I think what's really important about the Permanent School Fund is it's grown to be in excess of $65 billion over the years. It too capitalizes on oil and gas wealth. They recently, I shouldn't say recently, a few years ago, they were able to add to that because they got acreage in the Gulf of Mexico that the leases off of that continue to fund and pour money into the endowment. They have an interesting distribution rate. It is a max of 6%, but you kind of go, ours is 5%, and they say it's high, 6%, but this is averaged over 10 years, not 5 years, and so it's actually a lower. The State Board of Education is charged with determining what that draw rate should be, and then it goes to the legislature, and it is all to be used to fund public schools in Texas to ensure that all children in Texas get an education. No one receives a personal payment. There is no dividend. And so school funding looks very different in the state of Texas because they have a guaranteed dedication with the endowment of the Permanent School Fund. Moving a little bit to the west from Texas into New Mexico. New Mexico created their land grant permanent fund in 1912. You'll notice they have a distribution rate of 6.25%. That was just changed in 2022. They added, so they have a 5% on a POMV on a 5-year average, like we do here in Alaska, but they added 1.25% to dedicate to early childhood education. And so and that was by constitutional amendment in 2022. And I think what's really important to note here is that they've also approved a safeguard. So the fund value cannot drop below $17 billion and continue to distribute. So while it has $32 billion on their last posting, which was 2024, I haven't seen the 2025 value yet, they will continue to draw at this rate. 1.25% will go to early childhood education. The 5% will go to fund public education in New Mexico. And then if the corpus, as we would refer to it, gets drawn down and it hits that 17 billion notional amount, all the draws will stop. One of the things neither Larry or I talked about, and we're all assuming that you are very familiar with, are the odd mechanics that are the Alaska Permanent Fund. And because of our constitutional amendment, we have a separate account that appropriations are made from. None of these funds, Texas, New Mexico, and Wyoming is the one I'm going to talk about next, have these separate earnings accounts. They are all withheld, they are all encompassing into one fund. So that is a primary difference. So Wyoming also has a 5% on a 5-year average. So, you know, our 5% POMV has a lot of company out there. It has about 12 billion. Wyoming's a little bit different because they have a few different funds that they've created. This is the Mineral Trust Fund, so it is the closest to what you would recognize as the Alaska Permanent Fund. It too was created in the 1970s, similar to the Alaska Permanent Fund. It has a spending policy that is statutory, and it too has a floor guarantee. So they will not, you know, they will not draw below that floor. And like Alaska, they use this for fiscal stability to fund government services. So there is no dedicated beneficiary, but they have never paid a dividend. They have never had that individual compact versus an institutional compact. So they do not see the fights in Wyoming that we see here in Alaska. So how do we create this post-PFD, just sort of laying them all beside each other? You can see that there's a lot of similarities in how much, in what they use it for, but none of them have a citizen dividend. And we've known for a long time that Alaska is very unique with the creation of a dividend. But we can change that. We can think about whether or not that individual benefit should be changed or how it could be changed in order to make sure that the fund and the fund continues and that we have a prosperous state. So I hope, oh, look at that, right on 10 minutes. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to John to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you so much. Everybody give Angela a round of applause. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the most controversial thing said here today is going to be that Texas got a dividend before, or a fund before we did. I don't like that at all. Representative Carolyn Hall is our next speaker. She represents Anchorage's Turnagain, Spenard, and Sand Lake neighborhoods, District 16. She was elected in 2024 as a member of the House Majority, a former television news photojournalist, and has served as the Municipality of Anchorage's Communications Director. She has a master's in public administration from UAA, also my alma mater. Please help me welcome Representative Hall.
I'm going to warn everybody, I hate speaking into microphones. I will do my best.
I was told to switch these microphones, so you try this one, yeah.
All right, I will try this one instead. All right. Thank you very much to Commonwealth North for this opportunity to present here to you today. I'm going to start with a thesis, and my thesis is Alaska will not achieve a durable and stable fiscal plan until we figure out what to do with the permanent fund dividend. Let's start with the Constitution. The permanent fund itself is in the Constitution and is indispensable. As mentioned previously, it was created by the people in 1976 by a constitutional amendment. It created Article 9, Section 15, and its 2 sentences, 73 words, none of which are dividend. We also have other constitutional obligations, providing and maintaining public education, the University of Alaska, public health, and public welfare. It's all about having a functioning government. In 2016, Governor Walker vetoed the dividend, triggering a lawsuit, Wielechowski v. State of Alaska, where the Alaska Supreme Court found, absent another constitutional amendment, the dividend program must compete for annual legislative appropriation, just like any other program. The lawsuit was an important milestone in Alaska's history, proving that if we build our budget prioritizing a full dividend, we risk not meeting our constitutional obligations, including the oath of office that we take when we first are entering office. My next premise is the dividend is not a right. Rights are shielded in the Alaska Constitution in Article 1. They are guaranteed and protected in the Constitution and by the courts. The dividend is secondary to the Constitution. It's in statute. It was created by the legislature in 1982. The dividend is not a right. If it was a right, it wouldn't be up for debate every year, nor subject to legislative appropriation. So what is the dividend's value? The dividend has a tremendous value for lower income Alaskans. It helps reduce poverty by 20%. It's a lifeline that conventional safety net programs cannot replicate for lower income Alaskans, especially in rural Alaska. And eliminating the dividend without compensating measures would cause harm. There are two additional positives that come with the dividend. It allows the opportunity for important higher education savings through Alaska's 529 program, and it allows the opportunity for recipients to donate their dividends to nonprofits through the Pick, Click, Give program. So what kind of an Alaska do we want to live in? Larger dividends make it more difficult to pay existing and future state obligations. We have a $2.4 billion backlog for deferred maintenance. Of that, $1.5 billion is the University of Alaska's deferred maintenance. In the current FY27 operating budget that the House recently passed, it includes spending nearly $1 billion for dividends. Comparatively, last year, this current year, FY26, but the checks went out last October, we spent $685 million on dividends. Comparatively, when you look at the capital budget, we spent just $180 million. This is a swoop graph, and I know it's hard to read, but the blue bars that you see, that's Governor Dunleavy's proposed FY27 budget. The red bars are the FY26 management plan, so that's our operating and capital budget. The tall blue bar that you see there on the left, that is how much the governor wants to spend on dividends. If we prioritize spending the full dividend, like the governor wants us to, it would mean zero funding for most state services and departments. No Department of Public Safety, no University of Alaska, no Department of Family and Community Services, no courts, no Department of Labor, no Department of Natural Resources. In other words, we wouldn't be meeting our constitutional obligations if we paid a statutory dividend. Alaska is in decline. We've had 13 years of net outmigration. Our schools are starved for funding and are closing. And as I'm sure some of you are aware, there are some schools, in particular in rural Alaska, that have wings and sections that are condemned. The Dalton Highway needs critical maintenance and repair. That's important to business and to industry, especially on the North Slope between Fairbanks and Dead Horse. Just as the Alaska Marine Highway System, they're in desperate need for support. And there are long delays in issuing permits for businesses and SNAP benefits for those who qualify. The dividend asphyxiates our ability to provide meaningful public services Alaskans want and need. Being financially prudent carries big political risks. The dividend is a political fight every year. pitting Alaskans against Alaskans. It tears us apart. The dividend has made it politically impossible to have rational fiscal policy discussions. It has created an expectation of government cash payments that makes any fiscal reform, including broad-based taxes, politically toxic. So I propose we do two things. One, we pause the dividend until we can reasonably afford it. And two, we should focus our spending on meeting constitutional obligations and on the $2.4 billion deferred maintenance backlog. Let's spend our money on things like rural powerhouses so that they are maintained and operational, and so that communities can have reliable heat and power. Let's provide running water to the 3,300 rural homes that don't have it, and that leads to poor health outcomes. Let's bring low-cost energy to Alaskans. We know how to do it, we just don't have the money to do it, or perhaps the political will. But we can start rebuilding our state if we temporarily pause the dividend, bring function back to state government, and improve Alaskans' quality of life. I reread Dave Rose's book, Saving for the Future, over the interim, and I want to read an excerpt. As Alaska's oil revenue shrank through the 1990s, the legislature became a chronic deficit spender, raiding accounts of one-time revenues in order to avoid, for one more year, having to impose taxes or spend permanent fund earnings. He goes on to say Alaska paid a significant cost for allowing oil production and prices alone to determine its spending. Roads and bridges deteriorated, schools lost staff and programs, University of Alaska facilities fell into disrepair, and aid to local governments evaporated, forcing small cities to disband or face bankruptcy. Although we had ample income to cover our needs, legislators preferred to let our infrastructure fall apart rather than be perceived as raiding the dividend fund. Sounds like Groundhog Day all over again. We are choosing to do this to ourselves when it comes to our deferred maintenance and all the needs of Alaskans that are becoming quite desperate. And it doesn't have to be this way. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Representative Hall. Up next, we have Representative Stapp with the House Minority. Oh, I'm sorry, there you are. I know who you are. He represents East Fairbanks, Fort Wainwright, and Badger, District 32. He's a member of the House Minority. He's an Army veteran and served 2 combat tours in Iraq. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Well, I didn't think I'd have to stand in front of people and be the first PFD defender today. It's kind of ironic, I think, you know. So I'm going to have a little bit of different take. I'm going to actually argue that nobody in this room actually should want the dividend to go away completely, because what will happen is you'll pay massive taxes and your resources will get locked up, and you'll be basically a state that environmental tourists come here to look at fun animals, and retirees live to stay here because there won't be any industry and development and economic opportunity in the state if you do that, right? Okay, so, oops, what did I do here? I'm like Larry. Okay, that works, doesn't it? You know, maybe. You want to fix that for me, Ross? Okay. Oh, perfect. Be smarter than the clicker. Okay, so the first thing I tell folks about the dividend is, I don't know, you know, folks, I grew up poor, right? My mom died when I was 7. My dad left. I was raised by my grandparents. I joined the Army to give myself better opportunity. And I got stationed in Alaska when I was 19 years old. I was a paratrooper in the infantry. I volunteered to go to my first deployment here. Ended up deploying at a 3rd Battalion, 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment in Anchorage, Alaska for our Iraq deployment. I'm not a person who grew up with means or money. So like when people talk about the permanent fund dividend, like it's a big deal to them because it's the one thing that they count on every October to like meet their reliable daily needs. I grew up in Washington State, folks. When I came to Alaska, I became a resident because I didn't like paying taxes. So always been a Republican. That's probably the number one reason why I don't like the taxes, you know, and Alaska sounded like a great place because we didn't have the taxes. So the first thing you should probably understand is you should have a heart for people, and two, think about the public perception of the dividend because it matters. If you ask most Alaskans like what the PFD is, They think that like it's directly tied to your resource wealth, right? A lot of folks don't actually understand that it comes out of this fund that we appropriate because the royalties were deposited. They think like the more oil and gas and the more mining that Alaska does, the bigger the permanent fund dividend check is, right? Because they're told, rightly or wrongly, I'm sure it'll get into the debate, that Alaska's resource owner state, i.e. all of our resources are collectively owned by the states in the Constitution, and that this is their share of Alaska's resource wealth, right? So, it just reinforces the idea that the resources in the state belong to the people of Alaska, and that the check that they get every October is their share of that resource wealth, right? And that's kind of important, I think, for people to understand, because if you operate under that perception, it makes like really good sense why people are so upset about the PFD, right? Because they feel like, hey, they don't own mineral rights here in Alaska, and like the dividend check that they get, that's their share of these collective resources that they don't own. So the problem you have currently, as you see on the right side here, hey, oil and gas production, that's going up, state revenue, that's going up, but people's permanent fund dividends, they're going down. So you have a public perception problem, all right? What does that do? Well, last week I took a vote. I cut the dividend down to $1,500. I did that because it is the largest reliable dividend that you can afford in the event that you don't spend more money on operational expenditures. As Larry told you, you'll probably end up with a smaller dividend than a $1,500 PFD this year because people are going to want to spend more money, right? So these are some quotes I got. I didn't name the people because I didn't want to be too bad. The people on there that have names, there aren't real names, but Remember the healthcare CEO, would love to see a public hanging again. I got thick skin, folks. So this actually doesn't bother me. And the reason I put those up there is because I don't want you to actually hate these people, right? You shouldn't be mad at these people. You should be mad at the people that tell them reasons why they don't get a full dividend. I'll be very clear. If you want a full PFD, you got to do two things, or a combination of these two things. You got to tax people, or you got to massively cut state services by $1.6 billion, okay? Those are the two things you got to do. So if you want a full statutory dividend and you don't want to cut state services, come up here and tell me $1.6 billion in tax combination that people are going to pay. Or if you don't want to pay taxes, tell me $1.6 billion in cuts that you're going to make to state government. Okay, it really is that simple. That is that three-legged stool that you have to talk about, okay? So here are two of my colleagues. They don't say that. You know what they say? They say, we move money to the corpus so we could just pay in a dividend. Okay, what do they mean? They mean, well, if we just steal from future dividends out of your PFD today, we can pay you a bigger PF today so we can pay you a less PFD tomorrow. Okay? That's probably not a wise thing to do. The other one is savings. You say, yeah, Alaskans could follow its own dividend statute today. Every legislator knows this. Choosing not to do that is a policy decision. And then finally, it's not about priorities. It's about priorities, not math. Folks, numbers don't lie. People do, okay? It literally is about math. Again, tax people or reduce government services. Those are your options, okay? By the way, kudos to the governor. He finally decided after 7 years he'd roll out a tax bill telling people that they wanted to pay for dividends. And you know what? It was resoundingly hated, right? And I'll tell you the most interesting thing about me, all my friends in my caucus who love the full dividend, almost every single one, not a single peep saying they wanted to do the tax bill. Not a single person went out publicly and said, we should do big sales taxes or big industry taxes to do dividends. Why is that? I don't want to tell the truth, okay? I don't mind. Everybody knows, Will, I do not like the taxes, okay? Now, there's certain situations where, yes, you should look at oil and gas production tax. You should revise things. I just fundamentally don't believe you should have a statewide income tax or a statewide sales tax if you're going to give people a check. I just don't believe that, right? And I've said that since the first day I ran for office. It's not popular with some people. It's just what I believe. And if the voters where I represent don't like that, they'll throw me out of office and they'll elect somebody who does want to do taxes for dividends, okay? That's how I feel. Okay, so why is the dividend important, and why do I actually want to make sure that the state has strong fiduciary responsibility to maintain it, right? So just some background. Most of this has been talked about, so I won't talk about the changes in the permanent fund. Angela did a pretty good job of kind of explaining like that, so I'll skip over that. But I like the dividend because the dividend acts as a de facto spending cap on government spending. Do you know why? It forces everybody who votes for wasteful spending to justify to their constituents why they want to give Dolly Parton another $1 million to send books everyone throws in the garbage bin, right? And take it out of your PFD. By the way, my kids get the Dolly Parton books. I love those Dolly Parton books. But I'll tell you what, I'm not going to give her $1 million of state money. I'll go to Dollywood and take my kids to her resort, though. That was fun, you know. This is what I mean, guys. Just because people want to spend money on stuff doesn't mean the efficacy of the spend is wise spend, all right? I've had so many conversations on house finance with people, and almost everybody who wants to spend money on some sort of government program, they come from a good place. They want to say, I want to help kids, I want to help people, okay? Very rarely are you going to find folks that actually look at the efficacy of how the money is spent, i.e. two questions. First is, where the money goes and what the money does. You got 40 people in the House and 20 people in the Senate, and very few of those people can actually answer those questions, okay? So before you end the PFD, before you tax people, you should probably answer the fundamental question, what does the money you spend already do, and where does it go, right? So I'll skip over that too. My fiscal policy position, very simple. States should not implement bribe-based taxes unless PFD is gone. States should prioritize sustainable revenues, resource development, fiscal discipline over program expansion, because a strong PFD, disciplined spending, actually equals long-term stability, and I'll tell you why, okay? The main reason why is the future of Alaska is built on resource development, okay? We are a one-trick pony people, right? We are an extraction state. Ideally, we will make investments so we can be a value-added state to the resources we extract, but we have 734,000 people who live in this state. We have the biggest coastline in the entire country. We are geographically 1/3 of the United States, and there is no combination of income tax or state sales tax that's going to raise you $15 billion, people. It is squeezing a lemon that doesn't have a lot to give. So unless you decide that you want to maintain something that keeps the voters of this state tied to resource development, all you're going to end up having is a trust fund that people spend money out of that will never provide enough revenue for all the needs and wants of the state of Alaska, okay? So you heard folks talk about, and we'll get in this Q&A later, and I know I'll wrap up here soon because I'm probably almost out of time, but you heard folks talk about how we have all these needs in the state. Folks, Alaska spends the largest per capita of any state in the entire country, and it's not close, okay? It's not close. You got a state that's got 734,000 people, and it's got a supermax prison in Seward, okay? Go to California and find me a town with 700,000 people that's got a supermax prison there and 17 other prisons, okay? If you want to be realistic about the future of the state, you can't think you're going to be all things to all people in a state with 730,000 people. So I think you should invest in the state's future. You should make cost of living go down. You should keep the PFD around because otherwise you're going to get big taxes and you're going to go nowhere anyways because people are just going to keep leaving here because there will be no economic opportunity in future. Because the alternative is what we're at right now, which, as I said earlier in Finance Committee, I'll use it again as a fun terminology. You don't want to be trapped in a bureaucratic malaise that's slowly designed to grind your soul into powder, so that's why you should keep the dividend. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Representative Stapp. I tell you, man, I am 0 for 2 on you two guys. One of you is going to have to wear a beard. Oh, darn it, here it is. Senator Robert Myers, he represents North Pole in the Fairbanks North Star Borough, Senate District Q. He is in the Senate minority. He was born in Fairbanks, grew up at the family's Salchaket Roadhouse. Did I pronounce that right? Salchaket, I was close. Put himself through UAF driving a tour bus, currently drives truck on the Hall Road, father of 5, ran for office to build in Alaska his children will choose to call home. Please help me welcome Senator Myers.
Appreciate it, John. So Let me start off with a question for everybody here. And I think Will touched on this already a little bit. Thanks, Will, for stealing my thunder. So does it feel like Alaska is kind of stuck? We're in a little bit of a malaise, maybe, to use President Carter's word. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about why that is the case, how it's been going on a lot longer than we think, and honestly, how the permanent fund is helping to keep it going. So permanent fund, of course, starts with the old J. Hammond quote. Want to take finite wells of oil and turn them into infinite wells, pumping money forever at us here. And I say that because from an economic perspective, there is a lot of things in common between money coming out of oil wells and money coming off of investments, in this case, the permanent fund earnings. And it's especially interesting to watch the incentives that both of them create for government. So both of them are income streams that require little effort on government's part. They are heavily concentrated wealth compared to the rest of the economy. They carry the potential to be capital for business formation if they're allowed to do so. Because on an economic standpoint, the PFD is not just a check, it's effectively a stand-in for royalties that go out to individuals. And we're going to touch on that a little bit later. So I want to talk about three different disconnects that the permanent fund and originally the oil created in Alaska. Okay, because what we have done is we have disconnected state revenue from the economy as a whole. And all of this is perpetuated by using permanent fund earnings. So first off, we have separated the government from the economy. This is not a new idea. This was identified by Scott Goldsmith back in the 1980s over at ICER. And basically, the result is because government does not get its money from the economy, government doesn't care about the economy. At best, government is indifferent to economic potential, economic growth, where most of us live and work and try to make a living. We hold yearly hearings in the legislature on oil income and on the permanent fund, but you hear almost nothing out of the legislature about hearings or other concern about the health of the private economy in general. And sometimes we're actually hostile to economic growth because economic growth means more people, which means more services, means more kids in school, more troopers, more road maintenance, got to get more troopers on the road, keep us from doing stupid things on Friday night, etc. But economic growth does not mean more revenue to pay for all of those services. And that's part of the debate that we're having right now about the gas line. Does the gas line bring in enough revenue to justify the economic disruptions and the economic growth that it's going to create? Now, the second disconnect is the disconnect between the voters and the cost of government. Voters don't have to pay for government. From their perspective, everything is free. And human nature being what it is, if something is free, you always ask for more of it, right? That's why we love buffet restaurants. So the incentive is always to ask for more stuff. What the voters are missing, besides an incentive to ask for less, is an incentive to care about the quality of what gets spent. Because again, we're not paying for it. So why do we have an incentive to care about the quality? So because the average voter doesn't care about the outcomes unless there's a crisis, we're always leaning towards a crisis. Hence the deferred maintenance problem. I'm going to get to that in a little bit more. The third disconnect is we disconnect short-term thinking from the long-term consequences. Now, politics in general leads itself to short-term thinking because the election cycle, all of us are thinking about what we're going to do for the budget for 1 year, a 2 to 4 year election cycle. But in all of the other states around the country, everybody has to have the long-term consequences in the back of their head because they know that if they make a bad choice, it might not come back to bite you next year, but it will come back to bite you 10 or 20 years down the line. But because we have the oil revenue and now the permanent fund, we don't have to think about that in the legislature. So you can get some short-term benefits, such as certain types of taxes that we don't have to levy compared to most other states. We get high, but also highly variable spending. And those cause long-term problems, but the legislature is insulated from those long-term effects because there's no economic connection. The ICER research that came out at the beginning of this year also made it relatively clear that looking at the different types of revenue that the state can pull in, that oil and corporate taxes have the smallest short-term economic effects. But they also have the worst long-term economic effects because they build, they multiply, whereas things like personal taxes do not. So what have we done? We have chosen things that have the smallest short-term pain, because that'll get you reelected, but have the worst long-term pain, because by then, what do I care? I've already got the money, maybe I'm already out of office. That's not something I have to worry about. On the spending side, we do something similar. We build things, but we don't maintain them, because maintaining them is something boring that doesn't really get you votes, but building things does. So we spend, but we don't plan ahead. We spend based on what's politically popular, not what brings long-term growth. And we're now locked into that short-term model because the transition to a healthier long-term revenue stream would cause a lot of short-term pain, which of course would lead to a lot of politicians losing their reelection. So let me give you an illustration of that. As John mentioned, I'm a truck driver, so this one is a little near and dear to my heart. We're going to talk about road maintenance. Okay? This is an example of how our spending is disconnected by the economy and driven by election pressures instead. So this table on the right, which unfortunately Larry is sitting in front of a little bit. Larry, you're too tall. What I did here is I had my staff put this together a while back. We took the 1967 budget, which is the last budget passed before Prudhoe, and we said, okay, let's increase it by inflation and population, and then let's check that against what we actually spent last year. This is just general fund dollars, okay? This is not designated funds, this is not federal funds. And let's see what happens. Well, you're probably not surprised, most of them went up. You'll notice the big increases in education and health and social services spending. But I want to focus on the one that went down there in the bottom there. Department of Transportation. Now I said this is just general fund dollars. And this is just operating. This isn't the capital budget. It's just operating. That is important because that is where road and maintenance money comes from. We are increasing everything else and we don't maintain something. Okay? So we've had a lot of talk this year about the whole meet the match bit. We want to meet the $70 million that the state needs in order to meet the federal match for all of our construction projects. But I've noticed that we haven't talked at all about maintenance, really. True to the short-term model, we're talking about what puts people to work in the short term. These are projects that put people to work for a summer or two, but we are not talking about how that brings us long-term growth, how any of those projects actually benefit the economy in the long run. We're just talking about doing the projects. And this ties directly into votes because legislators can point to specific projects which create specific jobs as benefits for re-election. But you can't make those same ties with maintenance because maintenance is a base service, not a project. It's not tied to an interest group like a trade group or a union, so there's no legislative champion. But it is tied to long-term growth because better maintenance means fewer economic disruptions, means less maintenance on our vehicles, because if DOT doesn't spend the money to fix the potholes, you and I get to spend the money to fix our cars instead, right? And we compound our problem by using federal match for quote-unquote reconstruction projects. The problem is that we just let the roads deteriorate until we can qualify as a reconstruction project. Then we go ahead and spend that federal money to rebuild something that we should have been taking better care of in the first place. But then that means that we now have less money from the federal government that we could be using to fund true expansion that actually lets our economy grow. So we scrambled for $70 million to meet the match, but we didn't talk about the fact that we cut maintenance by 12% last year. It's about $13 million. The problem isn't money. The problem is our priorities. And our priorities are driven by our revenue model. People want to people want to cut a government pie for contracts, which is largely what our capital spending has become. There's no concern for the wider long-term economy. The private sector needs stability and maintenance, not flashy projects. Extending to other areas, you can do a ribbon cutting when you build a new school, but you don't do a ribbon cutting when you patch holes in the sheetrock or you put it in new HVAC. And then we wonder when we've we've decided that our budget is going to help us with 3 elections, and we wonder why our schools start falling apart. So let me talk to you a little bit about what this does to our economy in the long run. This is a graph of Alaska's economy since 2005, already adjusted for inflation. This does not include oil or government. If either of them were on there, it would be, both of them would dwarf everything else. And you'll notice something interesting here, that since 2005, our economy has been more or less flat. We've got 3 sectors showing growth, but there's a lot of caveats into that. So first off, that top line there is transportation. That's my bread and butter. Transportation, of course, is heavily tied to oil. And that includes, not only does that mean trucks taking things up to the slope, but also includes the pipeline. And as the pipeline has gotten older, we spend more money on maintenance, which means the numbers go up, but you're not really adding any production value. It's just that the share of the money going to the pipeline has to go up. Now, the one piece in here that is a little bit of a bright spot is this also does include increased air cargo over at Ted Stevens for the last dozen years or so. Now, that second line there, the green one, that's real estate. But that's not really productive growth either, because effectively what that is showing is not more transactions or more things being built. Really what that's showing is rising housing prices, especially rising rent here in Anchorage. And then the third line is healthcare. But again, healthcare spending is also heavily tied to government spending. My estimate, I'm having a hard time finding the firm numbers to back this up, but talking to some experts and looking at some trends from the last 10, 15 years, my estimate is that in this state, approximately 80% of our healthcare spending is done by government money in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so this is also reflected by the fact that we have an aging population, which has other implications for the system. The point here is that growth in our economy died long before the 2015 oil crash and the current fights over the PFD and other government spending. So it feels like we're missing something we need to grow. What we're missing is we're missing money that we need to jumpstart the economy because royalties go to government. Government doesn't pay attention to whether or not it's choking off economic activity. Unfortunately, what we're missing is small incremental gains that don't make the news but build healthy economies over time. We still have not diversified after 50 years of oil because, as I said, if oil was on the chart, it would dwarf all the rest of this. So let me give you the counterfactual. What if royalties went to the private sector instead? As I said, PFDs economically are a stand-in for royalties. There was an interesting study done in 2017 on natural gas growth in the UK and Pennsylvania between 2000 and 2014. In the UK, it's like Alaska, the royalties go to government. In Pennsylvania, it's primarily private landowners. So the short version, private royalties provide over double the economic bang for the buck compared to public royalties, despite higher natural gas prices in the UK at the time. And this is just the royalties. This doesn't even include other jobs or expenses from the industry expanding out into the economy. We already know that in Alaska we have a shortage of capital for business formation, despite the fact that 89% of job growth in this state is in startups. What we have done is we removed the best tool that we have to grow and diversify the economy. And we can talk about the inefficiency of handing out PFD checks and taxing it back, but the simple fact of the matter is we get more economic activity that way. And there's a reason that when Milton Friedman was up here in the late 70s talking to us about what we should do with our oil money, he said that we're best off handing out the money to people as checks instead of increasing government spending. And it's important to note that he said that in 1977, which was before the income tax repeal. So, I know, Ross is over here telling me I've got to finish up. Last one. So, last one here. So to sum this all up, we have a flat economy. Median household income growth in this state since 1970 has grown at roughly the same rate as a Rust Belt state. Since 1984, we have had the worst household income growth in the country. What we've done is we've deprived the economy of the capital that it needs to grow. We've encouraged a reliance on government for both people and businesses. We've discouraged long-term thinking. And then we wonder why working-age people with families are leaving the state. This is both the group that we need to build and the group most likely to think about long-term growth potential and trends, all because of the disconnect created by oil money and continued by permanent fund money. Reserving oil money almost exclusively, with the exception of the 25% of the royalties going to the permanent fund, Reserving all of that exclusively for state spending was the wrong choice back in the 70s. And we risk doing the same thing with permanent fund money now. Permanent fund money is being used to continue spending without connection to either the economy or the voters. In the 70s, we assumed more money was better, especially if it meant no taxes on residents. But we didn't think about the different incentives and distortions that each revenue source creates. We thought about the oil money ending, but we didn't think about how we would grow and diversify the economy beyond oil in the future. Thank you.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is the part of the evening where we open this up to questions and answers from the audience. For those of you online, I missed this in the earlier thing, but if you are online, I guess we can send in questions via text. The number is 1... Oh, they can do it in the chat. All right, never mind. I'm not going to give you the 1-800 number. I was feeling very, was it Jerry Lewis? Didn't he used to do a telethon? Now I'm dating myself. All right, well, so if you do have a question, before we get to the hand-raising part of this, I do want to remind you, we are here for a debate, but a civil debate. So stay happy, stay positive. You can ask hard questions, just don't ask questions hard. So, all right, wow, you were right. We'll start right here on the front row.
Thank you all for the panel, for joining us. I really appreciate that. I'm Bart Laban. I served in the Alaska State House for 4 years. They're in the middle of all of this drama with the PFD, so that's not a new topic for me. But I'm just curious if the panel would like to weigh in on a point that Angela made, and that is Alaska Permanent Fund keeps its money in two accounts, the earnings reserve and the principal. No other state does that. They have one single fund endowment. So the first question is, do you support consolidation of the permanent fund into a single fund endowment? And then the second part of the question would be the percent of market value draw. That's not protected in the Constitution, so that's subject to appropriation. The legislature could draw 6, 7, 8% at any given time. Would you support putting the percent of market value draw in the Constitution, and what percentage would you support?
And before we get to that, I forgot one last thing. Could I get you all to move your chairs over here so people can see you, because it's a little hard. And I think we're going to change the backdrop here in just a sec. But yeah, if you just drag your chairs out, and then, sorry about that, Bart, we can get to your question.
All right, I guess I'll start. The answer is yes and yes. As far as the draw, probably should go down. You don't want to create a situation in which the draw on the fund exceeds the overall value net earnings indexed to inflation, right? So you can calculate that in a bunch of different ways. We talk about this a lot, maybe 4.25, 4.75, something like that. But I'll tell you why. I mean, in theory, it's sad that you even got to do that, right? It's sad. So this is artificial distinction. The reason you don't want to keep $12 billion around is because people in the legislature are going to spend it. Right now, they don't want to spend it on big dividends, but when oil price falls, they're going to spend it on school maintenance or BSA formula, folks. Like, that's why you got to take it away from people. Like, I'm dead serious. Like, everyone says, oh, well, I will never crack that 5% draw on the permit fund POMV. You know what people said in the state? They said we would never take the ERA and people's dividends, that's sacred. And then it happened, all right? So the only way you prevent that stuff is to protect it by in the Constitution. Otherwise, people are going to get elected and they're going to spend the money. So don't do that.
I feel similarly to my friend here to my left. Yes, I believe that we should have a single account structure. I don't remember the name. Representative Calvin Schrage has a bill that would, if passed, have a vote to go to the people for a constitutional amendment for it to be a single account structure. I strongly, strongly support that. I co-sponsored that piece of legislation. And when it comes to having the POMV draw in the Constitution, yes, absolutely. I think the percent should probably be at about 4.5%, right around in that area. I tend to be pretty fiscally conservative when it comes to just our overall state financial outlook. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there.
So when Angela was up here, she mentioned that no other state does it in the two-account system that we do. But I did notice that on a couple of her slides that a couple of the states did have a protection of the corpus. You can't draw from the corpus in their case. And I also noticed that she mentioned that, I think it was New Mexico, said once you drop below 17 billion, you can't draw anything. That's effectively what our two-account system does. You know, the accounting side of it might be a little bit different, but the effect of it is the same thing. It keeps us from dropping below a certain amount. And the POMV draw rate is an interesting one. So we just had a presentation from Carolyn, the permanent fund consultants in Senate Finance a couple of weeks ago. One of the things they mentioned is they said if you take we draw from the fund based on a 5-year average. If you take all the 5-year averages of earnings from the last 30 years, the average earnings was lower than 5% plus inflation 14 out of those 30 periods. If you drop it down to 4.5, instead of being 14 out of 30, it's 11 out of 30. Okay, so we've gone from 48% down to 37%. Is that better? Yeah, a little bit. But it still puts you in a place where you could potentially be drawing faster than earnings plus inflation's coming in. So we're in a difficult spot here. I don't think that is the only thing that doing that is going to fix it on its own. You know, we also have to talk about how much the fund is earning compared to the fees that we're spending. When we're spending almost $1 billion a year on the fees just to get our earnings, are we really getting our money's worth with those fees? So we got a few other pieces to talk about there. And then of course the question is, what are we spending it on? If the point is just to grow a fund, well, we're best off just not spending it all on either government or dividends. But the question of if you have a savings account, the question is always, what are you saving for? Well, if we're just saving for government spending, we're going to be in a world of hurt, as I went over. If we're saving to put some money into the private sector, it's probably going to be better off in the long run. And if we're going to talk a constitutional amendment, we're going to have to address that split.
So I'm not a legislator, so I don't get to vote on the endowment, but instead I wait for legislators to vote, and then I write columns criticizing how they vote.
It's a good business model.
Okay, so I guess, well, one thing that hadn't come up yet, so yeah, endowment, that's great. You protect the whole thing. You don't have this arbitrary line between the principal and the earnings reserve, which everyone admits you can spend legally. It's probably need to look at the 5%. The problem is, even if everybody agrees, or most people agree, we need to go to a true endowment model. It takes 2/3 majority in the Senate, 2/3 majority in the House to put a constitutional ballot before voters. The problem is getting to those numbers because there are many legislators who say, if we're going to amend the Constitution, we're going to go the endowment, we're going to put percent of market value in the Constitution, I want the dividend in the Constitution, and then forget it. You're never going to get close to 2/3 majority. You need to separate it, or separate the political fight. Otherwise, you don't get to 2/3.
Angela, somehow we skipped you. Do you want to weigh in on this one?
Especially the fees.
I'm not sure where to weigh in on this, other than to say that I've been consistent in my advocacy for a single fund. This has been a priority of the Board of Trustees of the Permanent Fund since 2000, easily. It has come very close within one vote of moving out of the legislature onto a ballot. There are a number of unwieldy accounting rules and mechanics that the Permanent Fund deals with that as legislators, as Alaskans, we don't have to think about, we don't have to worry about, but would protect the fund, deeply protect the fund. And just like that constitutional amendment, saving the money for the permanent fund made sure that there is $80 billion there today, unlike the Alberta fund, which I did not talk about. A spending rule that is in the Constitution would have a similar effect long-term and provide long-term stability for the fund. So I think having that constitutional amendment, whether it's 5%, 4.5%, has a floor, doesn't have a floor, that's the debate that we get to have. But obviously, there's the possibility, I mean, Texas has a 6%, but it's over 10 years, and it continues to grow. New Mexico put a minimum floor of $17 billion. That was probably half of what they had at the time, and so it seemed like a good measure. So there are ways to limit this and create downside protection, but I personally would love to see a constitutional spending rule. And Larry's right to raise the dividend as a specter out there. And I think Will made a really good argument for how it creates a natural spending cap because it has to fight with everything else. And so, you know, I have confidence. I don't know why I say that today, but I have confidence in our elected officials to try and figure out how to solve this problem. Because, as Carolyn said, this is a problem that needs to get solved. It needs to get solved because it continues to distract us from investing in this state.
All right. Thank you very much for those. That was great answers. All right, we're going to hit, I'm not sure your name, so I'm Katie. All right, here we go, and we'll get you a microphone here in just a sec.
Thank you so much. My name is Katie Parrott. I am the president for the Alaska Association of School Business Officials, so of course it's all the finance people. As you know, as you're well aware, in the past, I don't know, this probably started a decade ago, there's been a lot of kind of pitting the permanent fund dividend against education funding and maintaining that system, as is, you know, outlined in the Constitution for maintaining an open public system, public education system for all students of Alaska. And so I'm just wondering about your comments about that, like how you think about that, a philosophy for this. I saw the presentation where other states utilize their permanent fund specifically for education, so I'm interested in that. Wondering just your thoughts on that discussion, and especially with the, you know, competing in some ways against other departments as well, such as the Department of Corrections.
All right. I'm going to start as the non-elected official, but who raised the idea of education. And, you know, it's kind of nice because it takes education debate off the table, and education debate creates its own weather storm, which these three can talk about dealing with. My point in raising it wasn't necessarily to pit the PFD against education. It's more to recognize that when the PFD was vetoed down by Governor Walker, I had a lot of people that year ask me what happened to the permanent fund money. And the fact was that it was just never drawn out of the fund. It stayed behind. And that really confused people because they're like, then I don't understand why I didn't get a dividend. And we never offered up to Alaskans the alternative of saying, we vetoed down this dividend and we used the other, whatever it was supposed to be, $1,000, and we put it and dedicated it towards another constitutional obligation like education, or towards another constitutional obligation towards resource development, or that we did this, that, and the other thing with it. And here's what we're going to use it for municipal revenue sharing, which we haven't funded in I don't know how many years. And so there were a lot of avenues that could have been walked down to say, this is what we're doing with the part of the dividend that you are now giving to government, but we didn't do that. And so I guess where I come from is the pit against the debate is something of our own creation because we didn't take the time to offer up that message.
That was a good answer. My answer is going to be, you're absolutely right. The dividend competes against that. It competes against every other thing. And honestly, folks, like, I'll tell you conversations I have in my own district. I had a person, we were going through finance budget cuts. We were talking about child care. State spends like $90 million, child care, Head Start grant, stuff like that. And they were going to add another $7 million to that. And one of my members on the finance committee had an amendment to cut that in half. That's an addition. So reduce the addition from $7 million to $3 million and give some of it to infant learning programs. And I had someone in my district, he's a big full dividend person. He sent me a bunch of nasty emails posted on Facebook and says, you cannot cut this money. And I told him, all right, well, keep in mind it's coming out of your PFD. All right? And it goes back to being honest with people. Because then you ask them a second question. And I'll harp on this all the time because people are going to stop being lying and being honest with people, okay? What are you going to cut or who are you going to tax? Okay? If you sit here and you run for governor and you say, I'm not going to tax nobody, you're going to get a big dividend, and you're going to get a $2,000 BSA, and you don't have to do anything other than vote for me, tell that person to go pound sand, okay, because they're lying to you, all right? I'm serious, right? Like, be honest with people. Like, look, there are people that say, you know what, I am a firm believer in the full statutory dividend, and other people need to pay taxes because I don't want to make cuts to do that. That is a position. That is an honest position. Or there's other people who say, look, I'm going to cut state services by $1.6 billion. We're going to have one trooper every 150 miles, okay? All right, well, you know, luckily you can use the money on the ammo and the guns you're going to need to protect yourself, I guess, you know? But that's a position too, all right? But be honest. Tell people. When I knock doors in one of my neighborhoods, loves PFD. I got different precincts. One of them where I live, they're big dividend precinct, you know. And they said, well, I thought you guys stole the dividend to keep my school open. Why is my kid's school closing? Think about that. Like, there's like, I thought you guys cut the PFD to keep my kid's elementary school. Now you're going to close my kid's elementary school. So, like, what are you doing with the dividend? Okay? That's like a very rational thing for that person to say. You understand? So, like, be honest and tell people the truth. All right? I am tired of like getting beat up all the time. I've had this conversation for 4 years. Every April it happens, people. So I'm just going to implore everyone else, if you run for office, you currently sit there, tell people the truth. You're going to cut a bunch of stuff, or you're going to tax a bunch of people. Okay? Or you're going to do crazy things like spend the whole state savings next year, you know? Thanks.
I wish I was as entertaining as Will.
Most of us do.
Yeah, I'm noticing a common theme here, and that is public messaging and communication and honesty with Alaskans. And I think for a very, very, very long time, we have not had that happen. And I think a lot of it comes down to political will. Additionally, over the last 10 plus years or so, there's been an increasing divide. Because it's not just funding public education, but there's people believe that education reform needs to happen in minor ways or in really dramatic ways. And I think that conversation really gets in the way as well. So it's a public perception issue. We have to be honest with Alaskans. And all of us take hard votes at one point or another. Sometimes we take hard votes often, just depending on our constituencies and depending on what their values are, what our personal values are, trying to explain to people why it is that we're funding public education the way that we are. When I'm walking my district, they tell me that they want to pay for public services because they're not seeing those public services received. And they talk about wanting their schools to be funded. And they talk about wanting their roads to be plowed and potholes filled. And in Turnagain, the Turnagain area where I live, that Northern Lights Boulevard, that median area, it's not maintained. It's maintained maybe once a summer. And you see the tour buses go by there, and you just have to wonder what are the tourists thinking right now when they see how everything's overgrown. So when it comes to public services, we have to be honest with where the money comes from, where it's going. You mentioned the Department of Corrections. Yes, that budget has ballooned over the years. And as my colleague, Representative Sarah Hannon, who sits on the Finance Committee, what she talks about is a lot of the reason why that budget is increasing is because of the policy decisions that we've made over the past few years. And the department does not have a choice because they have obligations that they need to meet to ensure the safety and welfare of those inmates. So I think I'll leave it at that, but public messaging is super important.
So the state constitution says that it is the legislature's job to operate and maintain a system of public schools open to all children within the state. Well, why is that? Is the point to have a bunch of flashy buildings? Our point here should be to educate kids, to have some kids that when they turn 18, they've had a good education and they're ready to go into the workforce or into college or somewhere into the next stage of their life. So why is it that we're focusing on inputs and not outputs? We should be focusing on outputs and saying, okay, what kind of inputs does it take to get us there? Instead, we're focusing on the inputs and saying, I don't really care what the output is, just as long as the input is staying steady or going up. There's something wrong with that priority. Let me remind you of another piece that plays into that. It's not just a straight dollar figure, okay? So I graduated from high school up in Fairbanks in 2001. While I was going to high school, my school was in the middle of a massive renovation and expansion because the school had been built in the 70s for about 850 kids, and when I was there, we had almost 1,300 in there. And by the time they were done with the expansion, we had room in the school for 1,300 kids. You know how many kids are in that school right now? About 850. When I graduated high school, we had about 17,000 kids in Fairbanks. We've now got 11,000. We've lost a third of our students in 25 years. And that's why in Fairbanks, we have closed 7 schools in the last 5 years. Now, I know that that's painful for a lot of people if your kids happen to be going to one of those schools. But I have to ask everybody the question, would you rather fund a half-empty building or would you rather put that money towards teachers and books? So we're down to making some of those hard decisions. Now, why are we losing students? Well, there's 3 reasons. One of which, some people are not happy about the quality of public education and they've pulled their kids out. They're either going to charters or they're going into the correspondence programs. I'll freely admit, I got kids in both of those. We're having fewer kids in school because, well, nationwide, people are having fewer kids in general. Okay, I don't think that we're going to be solving that issue anytime soon. But then the third issue, why are we losing kids? It's because we're losing people in general. We're losing the working age population that are the ones having and raising kids. I think Carolyn brought it up during her presentation. We've been losing people in this state since 2012. That was the high point of population for our state. And our population has been slowly dwindling, but the one part that is going up, the one demographic that's going up is people over 65. People over 65 aren't exactly raising 7-year-olds, right? I hope not anyway, for their sake. So if you want to put more kids back into school, 2 things that we can do to address that. Number 1, address the quality of what's being taught and the outcomes. Focus on the outcomes. You know, do the old Stephen Covey thing. Begin with the end in mind. And number 2, create an economy around here that actually employs enough people to keep people here at a living wage so that people have a reason to stay here and raise their kids. Because regardless of the state of the public school, if people can't find a job, they're going to come here and raise their kids and put their kids in our schools. So we're focusing, if all we're doing is focusing on the public school budget, we're focusing on the wrong piece. Is that an important piece? Yes, absolutely. But it's going to be influenced by so many other things. Because remember, our public school funding formula is a per student formula. You want more money to go to schools? Well, there's going to be 2 things. Number 1 is we got to figure out how we're going to pay for it. Yes, that's a completely and totally legitimate issue. And number two, ask why you don't have as many kids in schools either. So we're asking if all we're doing is pitting the dividend against the public schools, or the dividend against something else, or public schools against something else, because at the rate that we're going, within 10 years, we're going to be talking about public schools versus Medicaid. That's the direction we're going. So we got to ask ourselves the right questions.
I love talking, but looking at the clock and looking at the hands in the audience, I yield my time to the audience.
Larry, I owe you $20. All right, so I have a good news, bad situation. Well, Ross is paying, so 50. Go ahead. I have a good news, bad news situation. The bad news is, as Larry mentioned, we have run out of time for the Q&A portion of this. The good news is the food, the bar, and music will still be available until 6:30, I think, 6:30, somewhere around then. And if you didn't get your question answered, all is not lost. If you want, please submit your question to Ross through the email he provided, or on the chat if you're online. We will try to get as many of those answered after the fact as we can. If you're in the room, the speakers, I believe, will be hanging out for another 20, 30 minutes, and you can try to talk to them directly. We'll also be sending out the presentations and the YouTube recording of the panel discussion today. So I want to thank everybody for showing up here today. I want to thank you for listening to this. I want to thank our amazing panel. This was a phenomenal discussion. Give everyone a round of applause. Applause all around. All right. Thank you all very much for coming, and remember to come to the next Commonwealth North event.